Hi, I'm Mel CEO for Volunteering Tasmania, and I'm here with Paul Muller, who is our State of Volunteering Report researcher. We've worked with Paul for a number of years, and we're going to just be having a chat today about volunteering in Tasmania, and also what that looks like in terms of some of the trends throughout Australia as well. So thanks so much, Paul, for joining and being part of this conversation. Really appreciate that. So the first thing we want to chat about is the current snapshot of volunteering in Tasmania. So interested from the work that you do across the country, Paul, how does this compare nationally? So with older volunteers versus younger volunteers, etc.
Yeah, look, really good question. Tasmania, as a Tasmanian myself, can say this, probably isn't as unique as it sometimes likes to think it is. The way the demographics of volunteering split up across the state are largely consistent with how they do across the nation as well. That said, though, some of those demographic attributes are more acute in Tasmania. So, for example, Tasmania is much more regional and rural than the other states of Australia. So factors that impact regional and rural volunteers are more likely to impact here in Tasmania. The other thing too is education level is a very strong predictor of volunteering, and Tasmania has typically lower levels of education attainment than the other states. Having said that, though, Tasmania does punch above its weight there a little bit. So the smaller, more regional areas have higher participation rates in volunteering generally, and that's reflected in Tasmania across the board. It's slightly higher than the national averages for volunteering. There's a more sense of connectedness as well. People are more willing in smaller communities, and that applies just as much to Hobart. It's a good-sized regional town as opposed to a major metropolis. People are more connected. They are more likely to help each other out in both formal and informal settings. And by and large, the things that make Tasmania unique from the other states are the things that make Tasmania's volunteering experience. They are reflected in Tasmania's volunteering experience.
Great, and I know we often have the assumption that it's mainly retirees that volunteer their time, but what does that actually look like in Tasmania? So I know that we have a really high number of young people that volunteer.
Yeah, the younger you are, the more likely you are to volunteer, which is a bit of a surprise. However, it's it's a more mixed message when it comes to how much you volunteer. So those older people, retirees who do volunteer, they're much more likely to give more hours, but young people also give huge hours. The big holes in volunteering in the state are in the child rearing years, the middle year, the family years of life. So between the ages of about 30 and 50, that's where volunteering participation is quite low, and that's also where the people who do participate, the hours they contribute are quite low. Now, we've historically thought of volunteers as being, the older retirees who show up every, Tuesday between 12 and 4 to help out at the op shop sort of thing. And they're our stable, consistent, reliable volunteers. Young people aren't as visible as volunteers, especially in organisational settings. They do a lot of volunteering. They're more likely to volunteer than any other age group, but they volunteer in different ways and for different reasons. So they're much more likely to be motivated to acquire skills and experience that might transfer into the workplace for them. They're much more curious about the world and stuff. They're much more likely to do episodic volunteering, so short, sharp engagements. So, go helping out at, the tennis or a sports carnival, or for a fun run or a community market or something like that. Those little one-off not even micro volunteering commitments, but those more project-driven volunteering commitments that have a defined start and end rather than a regular ongoing commitment. And one of the demographic challenges in this space is, when I said before about how that middle, the 30 to 50-year-olds, have less time to volunteer, so they volunteer much less. There are also, relative to other states, less people who are 30 to 50 in the state compared to other states. Tasmania, where it sort of hollows out, our young people graduate school or university and then drift off somewhere else to do work. Some return for family reasons, but then we get a more influx of migrants, or retirees later in life. People sort of sea change, tree change down here as well. So we have, in that sort of vulnerable demographic, we have less people anyway, which makes it challenging. The other really interesting thing in that space, I'll add, is that those middle years especially, we see men volunteering at a much greater rate than women. So we know that women carry more of a sort of household load, as well as their own careers, but they carry a lot of family burden as well. That actually makes them less available to volunteer in many ways. So men, we often say volunteering is a thing of privilege. The wealthier you are, the more time you have, the more likely you are to volunteer. That seems true in family settings as well. Men are more likely to get to the volunteering opportunities in those very busy child rearing years than women.
Okay, so the next thing we're going to chat about is the difference between formal volunteering and informal volunteering. So, and why is formal volunteering so important?
Yes, so formal volunteering is what we typically think of when we call someone a volunteer. It's someone who goes to an organisation or a community group, and there's some sort of organisation around that volunteering, whether that's a sporting club, helping out at a school or something like that, helping out with your church or your religious group. That's what we call formal volunteering. Informal volunteering is just as real, but it's the things that you don't necessarily need an organisation or engage with an organisation to do. So, old Robert lives up the road from me, nearing 90. I'll go out and put his bins out for him every week and bring them back in. The mowing the neighbour's yard, the helping a stranger find directions. All those things that we do kind of spontaneously, and they can still have structure to them, like the putting the bins out, like the mowing the yard, that sort of thing. But they can also often be spontaneous acts. People also volunteer informally in formal settings. So a sports club, for example, might have a volunteer coach, it might have a volunteer treasurer, it might have a volunteer who runs the sausage sizzle, but the person who marks the lines of the field or puts the soccer nets up or the cones out or just jumps in and helps out behind the bar for 10 minutes when it's really busy, they're not really a formal registered volunteer with the organisation, but they are contributing informally as a volunteer when they do, the carpooling and stuff like that to take kids to games or something. So those informal volunteering, the way people informal volunteer is very important to society. The benefit of formal volunteering, though, is that and this is going to make me sound like a horrible economist here, but it's more efficient. So when you're informally volunteering, you're taking responsibility for everything yourself, the scheduling, the resources. Like I've got to go and, drag my mower up the hill. I've got to, these days I've got an electric one, but, I've got to make sure all my batteries are charged. I've got to make sure that, I've got access to the venue. All of those little things, and they're pretty easy things for me to organise. But if I'm formally volunteering with a group, more often than not, I can just show up, do my role, and go. The other thing that formal volunteering brings us is scale. So, informal works really well when they're micro projects, little things that I can chip in and help out. But when you're trying to achieve an overall objective and you need people working together to achieve that, a degree of organisation is necessary. So, if you're organising, volunteers, for example, to do the Mona nude swim, for example. You can't just have people showing up and helping out to something like that. But that's an important community event. That's something that has a high profile in the state as well. And by having that degree of safe organisation, it enables the participation to run smoothly as well. So formal volunteering has a very important place. But if we think back to what I was saying a second ago about youth and the way they volunteer and stuff, it's how, and a lot of their volunteering is, formal, informal, or perhaps semi-formal. It's how do organisations lend their expertise and efficiency and coordination gains and everything that come from that to people who want more spontaneous and episodic engagement. So that's a big challenge for the sector moving forward.
Yeah, certainly, and we've definitely seen a decline in formal volunteer numbers. So our last State of Volunteering report was released in 2023. Prior to that, the last report was 2019, and there was an 11.1% difference in formal volunteering rates between those two reports, so a decline of 11.1% from 2019 to 2023. So that's obviously significant, and it is challenging. Often charities and not-for-profits rely on volunteers to deliver critical services to community, and often they're really essential to community wellbeing as well. So for those organisations to be able to engage enough volunteers to provide the services that they do in community is really essential as well. So it's just about how we support those organisations so those activities still occur.
And there's an important thing in there as well, in that we know volunteering is more effective and it's more efficient when it's organised. But the people who are doing the organising, that's not something that you're just gifted with. That requires some skill development, a knowledge resource and base, and a whole heap of experience as well, and resources to be able to help you organise. And this is where it's really important that we have organisations again at a separate level that enable these organisations themselves. So if there's so instead of each individual organisation that organises volunteers, and yes, I'm getting sick of the word organise now as well, but if those organising organisations have support to share knowledge, learn new skills, learn new practices and experiences, that makes it easier for them to do their job as well, which is organising the volunteers and bringing them in, and the experience is better for everyone. So we can't just rely on a default of, well, these organisations have done it forever, therefore volunteering will continue in perpetuity. We're seeing people, one of the reasons youth, and this is some more deeper research I've done, one of the reasons that youth are doing so much spontaneous, informal and semi-formal volunteering, it's not only because of, the infrequent availability of their time with casual work and study and things like that. It's also because they don't have good experiences with organisations. And if organisations don't, adapt to the new ways of volunteering, because volunteering really is changing at the moment, then they're going to miss out. And as a society, we're going to miss out. And this is why someone needs to occupy this space where we can take the organisations on the journey so that they can do better at their core mission, which is, the services they deliver through the volunteers that they support.
Yeah,
and I promise not to say organise twice in a sentence or three times in a sentence again.
That's really great, and a really great segue into our next question. I'll just add to that one before we move on around formal volunteering. So you spoke to that being attached to an organisation and having formal structures around it to support the volunteer and the act of volunteering that they're involved in. So obviously that's really important as well, that there are those safeguards in place for the volunteers and for the community in which they're supporting. So making sure that there are policies and procedures, the volunteer receives training and support, that there are safeguards in place such as child safety where relevant. So another important reason why formal volunteering needs that support and why it is so important. So our next question, which I said was a great segue from what you had just said, Paul, why does the volunteering industry need support, and what could that look like?
Well, I think a little bit asked and answered there in terms of why the volunteering industry needs support, because it's a skill, managing and organising volunteers, and people, quite often the people doing the organising and managing volunteers are volunteers themselves in a lot of instances. Now, there's a lot of really good practice out there. There's some organisations and individuals doing exceptional work in this space, and some really creative and cutting edge work as well in terms of how they're engaging, for example, with youth, or how they're including people with disability in volunteering as well. So there's some awesome practice going on here. But someone needs to be gathering these examples of good practice and gathering these lessons learned and sharing them with others and turning them into, resources and tools, but also conversations even. Someone needs to be at the hub of that to make that possible. Quite often, and this is something that sponsors typically aren't willing to fund. When I sponsor, for example, a starving kiddie in Africa, for example, I want to see my money going to the kid. I don't want to see that money going to the layers of bureaucracy that, are keeping food from their mouth sort of thing. But that bureaucracy is really important. They're the ones who make those connections possible and do everything around it. Sponsors typically don't want to, though. They see their impact through the number of clients served or lives affected and stuff. They don't see their impact, and they don't particularly want to invest in administration. But we get that admin right, we get that capability and capacity right. Volunteering is a richer experience for everyone, and all of society benefits. So, communicating that message to sponsors, whether they're individuals, organisations or government, is really important. This work isn't possible, certainly not at the, effectiveness and efficiency that, we want to be able to deliver this, unless we invest in the administrative supports, the management supports, not just at an individual organisation level, but at a industry or sector level as well.
Yeah, that's really great. And you indicated before about the expectation that volunteers will just keep turning up, and we're seeing that they won't keep turning up if they don't have a good experience. So they find other ways to contribute through informal volunteering and through other things. So it is really important that we have that investment in the volunteer enabling infrastructure, which includes our role as the peak body to support the volunteering industry, to ensure that we can provide those opportunities for capacity and capability building, that we can provide training and events, produce resources and tools to support organisations. Certainly a lot of the work that we do is aligned to the national standards of volunteering. So, making sure that it is best practice, that it is informed, providing those opportunities, as you said, for those that are doing it well, to share their experience and to share knowledge and practice. So, that's really important, that shared learning, and we are seeing volunteering changing, so we need to be looking at things differently. Organisations need to be open to doing things differently and providing more flexible opportunities, understanding the needs of their volunteers and responding to those needs. So we can't just keep doing what we've always been doing, because we're seeing that it's not working, unfortunately. So it is a really key part of our role to provide that support to the volunteering industry here in Tasmania. We've been part of the development of the new Tasmanian volunteering strategy, which is a really important part of supporting volunteering in Tasmania, and that links through to the national strategy for volunteering. So that's a really important policy piece for us to ensure that volunteering is supported. We do need to make sure that we have funding as a peak body to be able to support the outworking of that strategy as well, and the strategic objectives that are outlined there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Volunteering's not broken, and when people leave an organisation, they typically find someone else somewhere else in some other way to volunteer. So it's not like people aren't willing. The one exception to that rule, though, I will say, is older people. Sometimes when an older person leaves an organisation because the role they were doing is no longer a fit for them for whatever reason, quite often they don't transfer to their volunteering someone else. They retire from volunteering altogether, which is often well before they've lost their usefulness, if you like, as a volunteer. So maybe they can't stand in the sun for 8 hours a day anymore and be a cricket umpire, but maybe they could be a scorer. There's other things that they could do. But these are the sort of lessons and discoveries that organisations are figuring out all over the place, which are awesome. But how do we connect that knowledge? How do we, there's nothing more frustrating for me, in sort of my day job than working for hours on a problem and then someone walking past my desk and going, oh, you just should have done that. It's like, I wish I knew that 3 hours ago, sort of thing. And the stakes are so much higher in volunteering, because when someone stops volunteering at that aged care home, because they're having a frustrating experience, or it isn't organised as effectively, they keep showing up and they weren't ready for them, or someone wasn't around, there's poor communication, whatever, then that impacts their ability and capacity to volunteer, and they might go somewhere else, or they might take a break, or they might find other things to occupy themselves. So the more we can skill the organisations, the more we can equip the organisations to do their job properly, the better, safer volunteering is not just for the volunteer, but for those vulnerable recipients of volunteer services as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned communication, which, is a really important aspect to that. And it's not about making huge changes often, or it's not about doing anything too complex, but just having really good communication with your volunteers. We hear from organisations that do that well, the impact from that, and we hear from volunteers who volunteer for organisations that do that well, and unfortunately sometimes organisations that don't, and the impact that then has. So I think, I mentioned before about understanding volunteers' motivations, having those conversations with volunteers from the outset around what their expectations are, and what they would like to get from their volunteering. So often we hear people volunteer because they're passionate about a cause and they want to give back to community, but then they often get more out of it than what they feel they give. That connection and well-being and sense of purpose, but also often skill development and lots of other great opportunities that could lead to employment if that's the motivation for the volunteer, for example. Really important to make sure that communication is consistent, it's ongoing, and that it is meeting the needs of the volunteer. And we certainly hear about different forms of communication, so not relying always on digital forms of communication. That works for some volunteers, but it doesn't for others. So finding out how volunteers want to be communicated with. So, they want to feel part of an organisation and hear about what's happening within an organisation, have regular updates, know what impact they're having for the organisation and for the community in which they support. So all really important things. And asking volunteers for feedback regularly. So how are you finding your volunteer role? Can you give us feedback on anything that we could look at changing or that we need to learn from? So making sure that there are those regular communication points in place is really important as well.
And look, the problem with communication isn't, most people can communicate reasonably well. The problem with communication in these settings is that we always underestimate how much time and effort communication takes. So, one of the things I say, however much time you think you need for, stakeholder engagement, double it and it's still not going to be enough. So we always intend to talk to our volunteers about their experience and stuff, but we just get really busy doing all the other 200 things. We always intend to, post regularly on our socials or, have the roster done 2 weeks in advance. But these things are complex and they take a lot of time and a lot of to and fro. And when we don't carve out and quarantine the time for communication, it's often the thing that gets blasted past. And that's often where communication breaks down. Now, don't get me wrong, some people are terrible at communication and need to work on their, interpersonal communication skills. Get me on a bad day. I'm one of those guys. It does depend on, attitude and things like that. But the thing people get wrong about communication the most is the time it takes. And I know, having been a volunteer manager as well, someone donating my time to manage other volunteers, that's one of the biggest frustrations is, recognising that I'm not communicating as well as I could and should because I'm not creating enough time and space for that. There's all these AI tools and cool things out there that, help us write emails and blast out messages and things like that. But they still take time too, So building time into communication is probably the critical thing. But these are the sort of things that organisations like Volunteer Tasmania run workshops on and talk to people about and, can show them how to do and get better at it. And these skills apply to your day job and to your home life, just as much as anything. So, it's just getting access to that knowledge and those light bulb moments as go, oh, yeah, that's right, that could actually work for me.
And like you said, that shared practice and hearing from others around, different ways that they've implemented those ways of working and strategies and communication points. So again, sort of planning for them. So as part of recruitment processes, making sure that you're having those conversations around motivations and what the volunteer wants to get out of their volunteering and their time, scheduling some regular points for volunteer feedback, whether that's through a survey or a conversation or however it's done. So certainly understand that. And a lot of organisations that we work with are really small volunteer run organisations even that have very few or no paid staff, very time poor, doing things off the side of their desk, as you said, sometimes volunteers that are managing other volunteers as part of their role. So making sure that we can tailor our training and resources and tools for those organisations to make them as easy to understand and easy to implement as possible, and based on best practice and what we know, and that shared learning opportunity is really important. You mentioned about AI, and again, really well done. Segue into the next question and our final question. So
We should do a
really,
podcast.
yeah, really interested to hear, how AI is expected to impact volunteering, or what impacts is it currently having on volunteering that you're seeing and hearing about.
Yeah, look, there's two levels of impact. The first is the AI tools themselves. So, and there's more and more. I mean, you can't buy a burger these days without it being AI powered. Yeah, everyone's that's the way we're selling stuff these days, and there is a degree of AI in a lot of things we do. And there is a lot of task efficiency that can be gained by using AI. I'm quite a heavy AI user myself. Myself and my team. It's pretty much something that's open constantly on our desktops, and it's almost like having a useful intern sitting alongside, doing some of that scut work for us a lot of the time as well. And we use it in more advanced applications and stuff too. So, in terms of efficiency and stuff, it's good. And you can also fall down a rabbit hole trying to find the latest and shiniest tool, which is what puts a lot of people off. But I think, the basic tools, whether it's ChatGPT, whether it's Claude, whether it's Gemini, if you're new to this space, I just say get in and have a play. Get it to turn your club or organisation's constitution into the lyrics of your favourite Taylor Swift song, and just have a play, have some fun with it, and you'll start to unlock and potentially see some of its potential. The second and probably more interesting challenging for the volunteer sector, though, is the way AI is genuinely transforming the world and the world of work. And there's a number of different impacts. I suppose two that I'll flag very quickly here. The first is AI is accelerating income inequality. So people with access to AI and people, the owners of AI, have a much greater advantage in the world than people who don't. And that's the same way as, for my generation, Gen X, people who had access to computers before others had a much greater advantage over people who didn't. And go back to calculators, go back to steam engines, go back to the wheel. Whenever new technology does have this effect, the owners of the technology and the early adopters and users of the technology will have a clear advantage, and that advantage manifests in wealth. We know what wealth inequality means for the volunteering sector, because the volunteering sector is often the organisations and the individuals who are plugging those inequality gaps, who are working with people who are experiencing some form of disadvantage, whether it's social, economic, physical, other, cultural, racial disadvantage. And so where we have rising inequality, we have more people experiencing disadvantage. So we're going to have more demand for volunteer services, for one. The other thing that AI is doing is, I described, how I use AI as a useful intern. What that means is I don't have to hire an intern. And we already have, we talk about headline unemployment figures of, 3-4% thereabouts. Youth unemployment, though, sits closer to around 10%, and that's going to get worse. So there's going to be a hell of a lot more people, especially younger people, displaced by AI. And at the moment, it's mostly happening in white-collar industries, so service-type industries and stuff. But it's going to happen blue collar as well. Like the tech is and building AI into machines, robots, for want of a better term. But don't think of the humanoid robots. Think about automated drain snakes and things like that. Like there's going to be more and more technology which will AI informed technology which will reduce blue collar jobs as well. And it's young people who are going to suffer that most. We know that young people want to volunteer or do participate in volunteering at greater rates. We know younger people are more likely to be motivated by new skills development, the opportunity to acquire new skills and stuff. Um, so they're going to be locked out of the workforce, or there's the funnel into the workforce is a lot smaller. The path into the workforce is a lot smaller. There's going to be more demand for volunteer services. There's going to be more young people looking to acquire knowledge and skills. So there's kind of a bit of a perfect marriage opportunity occurring here. But what it means though is that the people volunteering for organisations are now, in some respects, or going to become in some respects, just as much service beneficiaries as the clients you're serving. So you flagged it a second ago, Mel. You spoke about people saying, the volunteers themselves were getting outcomes, and benefits that were greater than, in their mind, than the benefits they were delivering to, the people in the aged care home that they were, reading to, or something like that. So we need to start thinking of volunteers, especially as younger volunteers, as clients, a different type of client, but just as much clients as the people we're delivering the service to as well. And starting to understand them that way gets you more in tune with their motivations and their wants and needs, and can get you in sync in a way that is going to be very important for all of society, in a way that society isn't. Certainly government isn't preparing itself for it all. Government's doing very little to prepare itself for the workforce transformation that's coming. Once again, the overworked, underappreciated volunteering sector is going to be expected to pick up the slack. But how they do it in a time of what's going to be very rapid transformation too. Like, this technology isn't creeping up on us the way that previous technological innovations have, such as computers as a technology that evolved over sort of from this novel thing to took about 15, 20 years before they were kind of everywhere. But now AI has just gone from 0 to 100 in the space of, it's only 3 years ago ChatGPT was released, and it's been insane the way the world of work has been transformed, and we're seeing massive redundancies now and massive layoffs, and these graduate intakes are now drying up that workforce has traditionally relied on and stuff. So there is going to be a burden that's going to be placed on volunteering. There's going to be a new type of volunteer and a new type of volunteer relationship that emerges out of this, and it's something that organisations can't be expected to figure out on their own. And again, circling back to what's unintentionally become a theme here, organisations are going to need to look for sector leadership from peak bodies who sit at this hub of knowledge, and who are taking this broader social scans and stuff and saying, hey, this is coming, we can help you get ready for it. And we know that these organisations are resource poor. They're not out there hiring consultants to solve this problem for them the way companies are and stuff. They need support through this transformation and transition too, given that most people who are in these leadership roles in these organisations are people who look like me. Middle-aged white folk who aren't necessarily at the cutting edge of what's going on in there in the world.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and we're hearing some information on the ground from volunteers and volunteer involving organisations about how they're using AI to support their volunteer programs and their organisations more broadly. So it is quite surface level really at the moment around supporting grant applications and some of their marketing and comms activities and things like that. So helping with those efficiencies, which is really great. But so much opportunity there, and like you said, just responding to the impact that has and the flow-on effects to the volunteering industry around potentially young people looking for volunteering as a skill development opportunity and pathway to employment, and organisations being equipped to provide those opportunities, really important as well. And sounds like a lot of work for us to do as a peak body. There's always plenty of work to do in supporting volunteering, like with 332,100 volunteers in Tasmania from our last State of Volunteering report. It is a workforce in itself, and it's actually the largest industry in Tasmania. So there's more volunteers than there are paid workers. So we know how significant that is and what that means economically as well. So replacing the cost of those volunteers would cost $3.6 billion, and the impact that they also have in their communities in terms of community well-being and their own individual well-being from volunteering. So there's so many economic and social benefits from that I think are often estimated and misunderstood as well. So our role certainly about lifting that profile, working in the policy and advocacy space with government to help them understand the importance of investment in this space, and supporting that volunteer enabling infrastructure, and then all the on the ground work that we do in supporting those organisations, and particularly our members, around building their capacity and that shared practice and best practice approach. Thanks so much, Paul, for joining me for this chat. We really enjoy working with you and your knowledge as an economist and researcher, and we certainly hope that we'll be able to work with you again soon to do another State of Volunteering report. We've included in our current budget priority submission with government a request for funding for that. It's really important that we have regular research to show what's happening in volunteering, so that then we can respond to any changes and identify those trends and so on. So certainly for anyone that's wanting to learn more, please visit our website, www.volunteeringtas.org.au. You can watch a masterclass recording from our State of Volunteering report and have a look at our last State of Volunteering report highlights document, and lots of other resources and upcoming events.